Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is the lovely Nora St. John.
Hey Brian, good to see you today.
Good to see you too. Good to see you too. It's funny, we say good to see each other. We're doing it online. We literally just spent 4 or 5 days sort of in the same location, not always around each other, but in the same location. We just got back from Pilates on tour teaching. So that was fun.
Yeah.
It was definitely an adventure, and I'm still recovering from the jet lag, and returning back home. I'm sure you are as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of adventures to be had there for sure.
Yeah. It's funny. It's also funny with the time difference because you're 17-hour difference. I'm 13 hours, and that doesn't make sense because we are heading in that direction toward the West Coast and toward them. So my body clock has no idea what time it is.
The joy of jet lag.
Exactly. But today we want to have a continuation. It's been a little bit since we talked about the three-dimensional training of the hip, and we covered a little bit of the knee. But what I thought we would do today is go into training of the knee in more of a three-dimensional way, trying to, balance everything out. So how does that sound for you today?
That sounds awesome. Let's carry on. Let's take it down the limb. Take it down the limb.
Sounds good. In one of the classes that I was actually teaching, part of the reason I thought about this was I was thinking, this is always a good topic because when training the lower extremity, again, most of what we do and a lot of what we do is very sagittal. And especially with the knee, I was just talking with someone about leg extension machines and how for so many years, what did we do in fitness is we had like 3 exercises, maybe 4. We had the leg press or the squat.
Yep.
Very sagittal. We had the leg extension machine, the leg curl machine, both very sagittal. And then maybe someone would do calf raises.
Right. And then if there was something else, it was that weird, like sitting somewhere and doing abduction against some weird resistance in a strange position. And that was always like, it was the weirdest position to do it in. It was like seated or, I don't know, it didn't make any sense to me when I was doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, that has always, that abductor, adductor, inner thigh machine where you could always spot the people in the gym who wanted to, perv out would sort of sit around that machine because the women seem to be attracted to that because, again, working in inner and outer thigh, quote unquote, was always something that people were interested in doing. But what did it do for us? I mean, it was not functional in any way, shape, or form.
No.
I mean, no way, shape, or form.
No, which gets us really to how we want to train the knee, right? Like training it to go front and back and even side to side. The knee mostly does a lot of front and back. So sagittal is certainly something the knee does a lot of. But anytime you even just go around the corner of your living room or, work your way around the door, you're going to be going into different angles between sagittal and frontal, right? So you're always taking those little differences, and they're always a variety, both in terms of the direction you're going, the vector you're moving in, and also in terms of how far that knee is moving in relationship to the hip and the foot.
Yeah. When
right? You're always adjusting that.
Yeah. When people think that it's purely a hinge joint, it's a hinge joint connected to 2 areas that are not hinge joints. So we can't really think of it in isolation as much as anatomists will want to because they're connected to 2 incredibly highly movable joints. So we really have to think of them in concert with each other rather than just thinking about only the knee joint.
Well, especially because people often talk about it as it being like the referee between the foot and the hip,
Yep.
or the slave of the foot and the hip, right? The foot is closed chain. The hip has all kinds of things that are telling it what to do. And the knee has to moderate between those two places, right? Its job really is to accommodate for what's happening in the hip and what's happening in the foot. It's that middle area, that transition zone between the two.
And whenever we do take a step in another direction, if we're, taking a step laterally or turning our body to the side or whatever it is, we're moving through the hip. The knee is, as you said, a slave to it. It's coming along for the ride. It's not leading the motion. It's really coming along with it.
Yep. It's not in charge. Whatever that foot does, if the foot's going uphill, foot's going downhill, foot's going up a stair and hits in a particular angle or runs into a rock, the knee has to respond to what feedback that foot is giving it.
That's an interesting way to think about it. I really hadn't put it together like that, but it really is following along with whatever else the foot is doing in a functional environment, not in an exercise, environment where most studies are going to be done in a vacuum or as much in a vacuum as possible. So the knee is often trained in a knee extension or a knee curl machine just because it can be done in a vacuum. But when you add in the ankle component and where the foot moves, that knee has to follow. That changes everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it really does. And that's something that we don't often think about in fitness.
One little example. So I spent a fair bit of time, overseas and in Europe and things, and walking on cobblestones is where I really, really feel that, because every single step, that foot is slightly angled in, slightly angled out, slightly angled down in the front, slightly angled down in the back, right? There's some angle going on because you're not on a flat surface. Mm-hmm. You're also not on something like sand, which, your foot conforms to. You're on a hard, unstable, uneven surface. And you do that for a while, and you start to feel how that knee has to respond to every single place that foot lands. The weight goes a little more on the outside of the foot, it goes a little more on the inside of the foot, and that translates directly up into how the knee is acting. The foot suddenly hits a curve and gets pulled slightly laterally or slightly into abduction, and the knee responds to that. So it's just, it is one of those things where every place that the knee or that the foot puts itself, the knee has to respond to.
And what's interesting when you say that is I can't tell you how many clients I've had who have traveled, especially to Europe, and not only on the cobblestones, but also in museums and the hardness of the floor, being on marble, being on, not surfaces that they're used to being on, and how that can really change the feeling in the knee. And when they come back, they're not complaining about foot pain. They're complaining about knee pain.
Right.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So, that is the intermediary between those two. And it's the one that, if the foot, if you suddenly hit something like, I always think of, I have a number of small children in my life at the moment. And, you're walking through the house and you suddenly step on or try not to step on a Lego, a small object. And what your whole body does in relationship to that, you don't want to crush it. You don't want to hurt your foot. So, you may roll to the outside of your knee. You may suddenly feel like a stress actually more in the knee even than in the ankle or the foot.
Yeah.
Just from having to avoid that. Or if you've got a small dog that runs under your feet, that feeling of moving not just from your foot, but all the way up into the knee.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because that, my kids aren't that far from that world and having to step around things and pets. We've got a dog. And all of a sudden you go to step over the dog and you realize you're stepping on its tail or something like that. And you're suddenly, trying to come off of it and you roll and your ankle is doing funky things. And you're right. It's the knee that often will compensate and will feel that.
So thinking about that from a three-dimensional angle, the knee, a lot of, I think, our philosophies, we've talked about this before, is our goal with the knee, our goal with any training really, but with the knee specifically, is to have it able to accommodate any of those sudden changes in angle, in position, in force moving through it. Right? Really, ideally, it is a relatively flexible intermediary between the foot and the hip. And it can tolerate a lot of different angles, a lot of different vectors of force moving through it. right? That's kind of what we're aiming for a healthy knee to be able to do, so that you can take that sudden step sideways or something to avoid something, and your knee goes, yeah, that's fine, I got that. Or if you're more of an athletic pursuit, if you're running through a field and you're dodging, dodging balls or dodging players or dodging something, that ability to quickly respond, moving that knee in all different directions and having it be able to do that, and to be able to do that gracefully and with strength, is what we're aiming for.
And when you watch someone who's participating in a sport like soccer, where there's a ton of pivoting, twisting, turning, your knee has to respond in all those different directions, all those different vectors, and force coming at you from so many different directions, because even though we're moving in one direction, when they're moving, or a baseball player going, trying to steal second, they're doing it laterally, but it's not a pure lateral motion, because their body has to change from lateral to sagittal and then dodge something. And there's a lot that goes on that is reactive within the joint.
As we mentioned a little bit last time, if you ever look at sports photography and you just look at stills of people running down the field, tennis players, anybody, football players, you'll see the crazy positions that their knees are in to accomplish the task they're trying to accomplish.
Yep.
That knee is not over the toe. It's not lined up in a sagittal plane. It's like the foot is over here. The knee is way inside it. The hip is internally rotated. The foot is laterally rotated, right? There's all kinds of crazy things going on. And so again, the point of that three-dimensional training of the knee is to be able to respond effectively and with strength and efficiency and stability to all those different motions.
Now let's add into that knee pain. Because you and I have both probably dealt with it. I've dealt with it personally, but with a lot of clients. We've both seen tons of people with overuse injuries, knee pain, tracking issues, all of that sort of thing. So balancing out, anterior, posterior, medial, lateral is incredibly important in that aspect as well.
Absolutely. Because, certainly with many cases, we found that if you just balance, for example, the stresses across the kneecap with the vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis, helping to track that knee a little bit more sagittally, or more really in the center of the groove in the femur, that alone can make a big difference for somebody, right? And then if you look at somebody, I can think of a lot of my skiers who get medial collateral ligament sprains, so the whole medial knee gets funky. Strengthening that up oftentimes takes care of that discomfort. So there's all those ways in which the knee really does need that support on all sides and balance on all sides.
That makes a lot of sense. And it seems common sense to me, but I don't think it's common sense to a lot of people who train the lower extremity, how we really don't think about balancing out the vastus medialis versus the vastus lateralis, because the lateralis is so much stronger. You can see it in pictures of people's legs. The vastus lateralis is so much larger in a lot of these people, and they do have that lateral tracking of the kneecap.
Yep. Now let's talk about that a little bit, because this is not myth busting. This is my thoughts on a common thing that you hear. When you talk about the quadriceps and you talk about the vastus medialis and the vastus lateralis, right, and how they track the patella in the groove, a lot of times what you hear is that you're looking for terminal knee extension, that's where the vastus medialis is most active. And I've heard that forever, and I've certainly have trained with that in mind frequently, really working on getting that last little bit of extension to activate that vastus medialis. But then one day I was looking at some of my clients, both horseback riders and cyclists, high-level cyclists, both of whom work with slight internal rotation of the femur to grip the horse or to make yourself as aerodynamic as possible in the bike. And both of them, those are the two people that I work with that have the best vastus medialis development.
And if you think about cyclists, not so much the horseback riding, but cyclists, in proper cycling, you never go to completely straight. Your knee never locks out during the circular motion.
Same thing in horseback riding. If you're doing posting or you're doing dressage, you're never standing all the way up on that horse. You're always going in a small range. not dissimilar to the bicycle riding range. And you're just trying to keep that grip, that medial grip on the horse.
And you and I have talked about this many times before. The adductor, in our opinion, seems to be the missing link when it comes to really addressing the vastus medialis.
Yeah, adductor, and maybe just even an inkling towards medial rotation of the femur. Not necessarily dramatic medial rotation of the femur, but it's more that sense of hugging the midline and really keeping close. There's that adduction with that just titch of medial rotation. Because again, there are not that many people that have really strong VMOs when you look at just muscle development. And those two groups, the only two that I found that seem to develop it without doing much work, without consciously working on it. So those activities are what are developing those muscles. Whereas dancers who are, losing their legs an awful lot and using terminal knee extension much more consistently than a lot of other people, I would say, just because of the aesthetics of the sport, often have no VMO whatsoever. A lot of the dancers I work with have the weakest VMOs I've ever seen. And what do? They work at external rotation, but they do work in a lot of terminal knee extension. So I really, that's where I put together that adductor and knee work are really combined to get that vastus medialis stronger and balance out the lateralis.
And what I find funny is for years and years, when they talked about bodybuilding and using that leg extension machine, if you wanted to get that VMO, what did you do? You turned your toes out. You externally rotated the toes to 45 degrees in order to get it, because it looks like it's what's facing upward. So everybody's mindset, and I still hear this from people all the time saying, oh, well, I turn my toes out when I do that to get more VMO. And I think that is quite possibly the easiest way to damage the knee in that machine. But also, you're not getting much VMO because you're externally rotating.
Certainly, again, based on looking at what activities develop what muscles, external rotation has not, again, in my experience with a million dancers over the years, shown to develop that VMO very well at all. It's really, again, medial rotation and adduction and keeping those legs really, really parallel that can develop that. And also not always working terminal knee extension, but working in that repeated short flexion extension, not at end range in either place.
I think this all came about, as I said earlier, when we think of research being done in a vacuum. And when you're just looking at VMO, when you're just looking at putting on electrodes and measuring EMG, trying to when you're in a lab, you're looking at the EMG and, oh, what's firing when? Oh, when I do that last 30 degrees, I see I'm getting more of the vastus medialis. It's not the only thing firing, which is what some people say. It's not. The entire quadriceps continues to fire, but it's firing the strongest, again, in a vacuum, in the laboratory setting.
And my other question, because I don't know the research on that, is was that done in closed chain or open chain?
It's usually done in open chain. It's usually done with a leg extension machine.
Right, because that's what I've seen is it's done in open chain. But where I see the strength developing is in closed chain, non-terminal knee extension.
Right.
Again, cyclists and horseback riders, that's seriously closed chain. That foot is anchored either into the pedal or onto the stirrup if you're on a horse. And that's completely closed chain.
Yep.
So it's a very different environment.
What's interesting too is when you think about trying to get the VMO just activated, what do? We're really hooking our fingers into that the most medial side of things where the adductor is. And when you tell people to push into your fingers or into their fingers, aren't they getting some of that adductor action as well? Aren't they pulling a little bit medial with the leg? And how many of them are also internally rotating a little bit at the same time? Yeah.
And certainly both those cues. So guys, if you're thinking about this, if you're looking at your knee right now, if you're following us along, and you look at your patella, I always go to the top of the patella, and then I take my fingers at a little bit of an angle, and if I go towards the middle of the leg, so the inside of the leg, and just follow myself up, you'll feel the belly of the vastus medialis there. And that's what we're talking about, is the vastus medialis is on that medial side of the knee, slightly above the medial upper corner of the patella. And so to get that to fire, you often have to use proprioceptive feedback, tactile feedback, your finger, somebody else's finger, I know for rehab, they'll often use an EMG machine to stimulate the muscle, or a muscle stimulation machine to get that muscle to fire, because it doesn't fire automatically for a lot of people. It actually doesn't fire at all for a lot of people. So this is really where you've got to work on it consciously to get it to start to fire, to try to create that habit of it firing every time you straighten the leg or contract the quadricep.
My mindset is now actually looking at this, trying to figure out, okay, something that I do with a lot of clients in this sense when I need to get that firing is terminal knee extension standing. You put a band behind the knee and it's anchored on something and you're working that last 30 degrees. And again, I do it for time and I do it for an extended period of time, minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, just repping it out. I'm kind of wondering now, just playing with it in my head, if, in slight internal rotation of the entire leg from the hip, not just from the knee, and maybe even one-legged standing possibly, or something that will get the adductor to fire a little bit stronger, maybe might benefit that. I'm gonna have to play with this because that's something that I haven't. So I'm just saying this is just a theory in my brain. So listener, understand, this is what Nora and I go through all the time when we talk. We come up with ideas and then we go, and it's kind of like, okay, discuss amongst yourselves. So we then go off and play, and come back and say, here's what I found. Here's what I felt. And again, it's very non-scientific and it's very theoretical. But for us, it's just opening up our brains thinking, oh, this might be a different way to look at things.
Right. And it's also, it's our thought process, and then it's also experimenting with clients.
Yes.
Right. That's why they call it practice, because that's all we're really doing with everybody that we see every day. It's like, let's just try this and see how it goes. And then, it's just gathering data, because then you do that for a lot of different clients. And over time, you start to see that, yes, it does make a difference, or it doesn't make a difference. Or for this client, it seems to help. For this one, it doesn't. Then you try to figure out why, all that critical thinking process. That's interesting, Brian. One thing I was thinking was in doing that, to not just have the band behind the knee, but almost to have it at an angle. So they're straightening the leg. Mm-hmm. So instead of being, I'm assuming you have it like in front of the leg, right? So it's like there's resistance on terminal knee extension, but pull it off to the side laterally slightly. So they're still having to go the terminal knee extension. Maybe the band's at about 45 degrees.
You think that much?
Between the foot. I don't know. Maybe just a little bit. You might just bias it slightly.
I'm thinking if it's too much. Yeah, my mindset thinks if it's too much, what's going to happen is they will be doing internal rotation, but I think they'd be fighting it depending on the strength of the band, for instance.
Could be.
That may be just a 5 degree, 10 degree to start with and just see how their knee feels.
So one thing that we do in the Pilates environment is, this is not a traditional exercise, but sitting on the foot bar and pushing the carriage away. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Usually with and this is interesting because it's closed chain, and usually it's just 1 foot at a time. So you're working on one leg at a time. And one thing that I've looked at that is how you place your foot on the carriage has an interesting reaction up into that vastus medialis, and it's different for everybody. So for some clients, I put their foot flat on the carriage, and they're pushing out with their whole foot. Usually I have to put a sticky under there or something so it doesn't slide, right? And they're pushing out with their whole foot. Sometimes that will really activate that vastus medialis. For other clients, I'll kind of put the center of the heel on the front edge of the carriage and push out, and that activates it. For others, I'll actually have them put the ball of the foot on the carriage, on the front edge of the carriage, and push that out. And with all of those, I will focus to some extent or other, of either with tactile feedback or just with verbal cueing, on the medial side of the foot. So pushing through the big toe, pushing through the medial side of the heel, pushing through the whole foot, but really feeling like that inner thigh is what you're working on, or the inner side is what you're working on. And then if that doesn't work, because one of those usually works, if one of those doesn't work as well, then that slight internal rotation, very slight, really just, tiny angle in.
Interesting.
Because again, it's closed chain, and I don't necessarily work full range. So it's, it's like being on a horse, like being on a bicycle. That's kind of what I'm trying to recreate with that, is just that work, and trying to keep the VMO going as much through the whole work as much as you can. So not just in that terminal phase, but through that in-between phase.
I find that interesting because when you focus on different parts of the foot, naturally we begin to think of the more heel we use, we're going to get more hamstring, more glutes, we're going to get posterior chain. The more on the toe you are, the more you're going to get pure quadricep and really within that patella. And a lot of people will feel that patella. So I almost think that doing it on the toe would activate, with a light resistance, might activate a little bit more of the VMO, but you're saying even the heel, depending on the person, might feel it completely differently.
I find it varies a lot because, again, I'm just sitting there with my finger in that VMO, seeing if it's going, and any of those foot positions will work for somebody. The heel is the most common one, actually, that works. The ball of the foot's another one, and sometimes the flat foot works best. So it's something that I just work with the client and see which one is most effective.
Yeah.
So so much. I'm not sure exactly what all is going on there. Some of it is that I think that balance between the quadriceps and the hamstrings, with any kind of flexion extension of the knee. And some of it is just how their particular musculature fires.
Let's dive into this a little bit when it comes to knee tracking issues, because that's what we find happens a lot is we have a lateral tracking of the knee. And what was interesting is in this class that I was just teaching this past weekend, the first question everybody has is, well, how can I tell? How can I tell if I'm having that lateral tracking issue? So I think it'd be a good idea for us to walk some people through this so that they can visually see on their own bodies whether or not they have that lateral tracking, but with the caveat that just because you see a lateral tracking does not mean that person is going to, there's not a 100% cause and effect, because I've got both knees that are laterally tracking and I don't have knee pain.
Yeah. So how I typically do that is seated with both legs straight. So, you may have to sit up a little bit or something, because I do want the legs straight for this.
I do too.
And then I usually put what I do is I have both my fingers gently at the top corners of the patella. Right, just gently, just so I can kind of see what's happening there. And then contract the quadricep, so just pull up the kneecap, if you will, and then see what kind of line that patella makes. And it's usually pretty obvious once I show this to people. They can usually tell pretty easily, like, oh, my mind has been laterally tracking for my entire life. It gets better. It's getting better with a lot of strengthening on that VMO, but it took a long time. And just notice. And a lot of people just go straight up. Like you'll see it's just a straight line. They just pull it and it comes right up in line with the hip. Other people, it will go laterally. And sometimes it goes really radically laterally. And changing the firing pattern may not change that much. Again, to your point, a lot of people have lateral tracking and don't have any particular knee issues. I know for me, I do have knee issues unless I keep that VMO really strong. If I do, then everything's fine. As soon as it gets weak, my knees will be irritable again. I get it a little stronger again, and it goes away. So it's a pretty direct line on that.
Interesting.
But it's,
Because even for me, growing up, I was on my bike that was my primary mode of transportation. Coming from Hawaii, small island, for me, always on my bike. By the time I was in college, doing 20 to 30 miles a day was not uncommon, a lot of hills. And for me, my vastus medialis is very, you can see it. It's very much there. It's very apparent. So for me, I have quite a bit of hypertrophy there. But even though I have hypertrophy there, my vastus lateralis is still strong enough that it pulls the kneecap laterally all the time. Not a ton, but it's very apparent. When you look at it, there's no question that it's going to go laterally. And the only thing I'm going to say is that when I test VMO, or not VMO, but lateral tracking issues, is where you put the fingers on the top. I usually put it around the sides of the patella. So when they ride up, I can feel which side it pushes against, manually. So as they contract, if it pushes against, one side, either my thumb or my finger, it's not only going to be laterally tracking, but I feel that tactile too. So for me, that's always a good way for me to see, as they contract. are they coming up and am I feeling that through the finger? So that's just one way that I, will do it as well. So I get the tactile as well as a visual cue.
Yeah, because that's really clear. You can really feel like it pulls much firmer on that lateral side. The thing about lateral tracking, though, is there's the muscle strength. There's also just the bone alignment.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're slightly valgus or slightly knock-kneed, it's going to be way more common to have that lateral tracking. So there's also just what is the structure of the bones and how does that alignment, with the quadriceps and the kneecap come about.
Something else to think about that I don't experience as much, but I have, especially this past weekend, and I'm sure you've had the same thing happen, is you ask for a volunteer and someone comes up and all of a sudden you're looking at them thinking, oh, I didn't expect to see this at all. Well, what I saw was I couldn't move the kneecap. It was so tight that, literally I spent, probably, 30 seconds just trying to get it mobile, just trying to get some movement there before I could even test.
Yeah, I've run into that just a few times with just a few clients over the years where it's like that patella is sitting so deep in that groove and is so kind of stuck in there that you can't, because usually as soon as that leg is straight, you guys could try this at home, as soon as that leg is straight and relatively relaxed, that patella should be pretty wobbly. It should be able to move, like little lateral, little front and back. It should be loose-ish in that groove. Sometimes it's too loose, and that's when you get dislocating patellas. But in that case, it's like, I had one client like that as well who was so tight in that groove that you couldn't move it at all.
Yeah, it was very interesting because I'd never experienced that in front of a class. So it was one of these things that all of a sudden I had to go, oh, okay, what do we do here? And a little bit of mobilizing it, just moving it back and forth, wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. And it was much better. It was it loosened up. I had them do the test and you could see it was laterally tracking. But I tested them again 3 minutes later because they were still on the stage with me. And it was just as tight as it was at the beginning.
Uh-huh. Wow.
It didn't stay loose. So it was just one of those things that in my mind, I said, this is something you may want to continue to play with and just loosen up.
Yeah. Yeah. Keeping that mobility there.
Yeah.
So this is often where I think both of us start with knees, is balancing out the quadriceps, vastus medialis and lateralis, and trying to get that patella tracking smoothly, especially with knee problems. Like that is 80% of the time, if you can get the VMO a little stronger and releasing some of the IT band, lateral leg tension, because
just think of that.
Reciprocal inhibition is a real thing with the VMO.
Yep.
Like if that whole lateral leg, vastus lateralis, and the IT band is too tight, it will not let that VMO fire. So you really have to do both pieces, so you can really get that reciprocal inhibition from that tightness on the lateral side. So rolling, again, there's all kinds of controversy about rolling it out. I've found it to be very effective. I don't use crazy hard rollers. I just use regular old rollers. Or manual work or any kind of thing that's going to loosen that up a bit will make a big difference in terms of the ability of the VMO to fire.
100%. I was talking to this class about this. I've seen a lot of marathon runners, especially coming from Hawaii. The Honolulu Marathon's huge. And I would see a number of these runners while they're training come in and they say, my knee is killing me. And they ramped up their running all of a sudden out of nowhere. And suddenly they're having issues. And I only have them do 3 things to start with. But I do have them release the IT band, especially down by the knee. And I say stick with a little bit closer to the quadriceps, so roll forward a little bit more. So you get a little bit more of that aspect to release the IT band. I have them do terminal knee extensions of some variety after activation. And then hip work, some abduction, either clamshell, straight leg raises. And often just doing those 3 things can, I hate to use the word cure, but can remind the muscles how to work properly again, that suddenly they're out of pain.
Yeah, those 3 things, again, 80% of the time, if they stick with that at all, 2 or 3 weeks, their knee pain's fine.
And usually that's it.
So, always where I start, because they think you're a genius. You're not a genius. It just doesn't really take a lot in that area. If you really just do that, it will often take care of a lot of knee problems. Again, not all of it, but some of it's like, boom, done.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I found is I'd make a second appointment for them in, 2 weeks. And almost everybody would cancel just because
Yeah.
it doesn't hurt anymore. I don't think I need to come in. It doesn't hurt. I'm like, good. Just keep doing what you're doing.
Right.
You're fine.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, we also have a lot of things that are not quite so successful and a little more complicated. So again, that vascular medialis, that's our first place we start. Now, the next thing that I'm going to bring up is balance of the hamstrings.
Yes.
Which I just find is interesting. So there's a medial and a lateral hamstring, right? Medial hamstrings are semimembranosus and our semitendinosus come down to the back of the knee and then also down onto the tibia. And then we have our lateral hamstring that comes down onto the fibula, the side of the knee. And those particularly have an influence on the tracking of the tibia relative to the femur. So just like we talked about that lateral side being stronger, if that includes the biceps femoris, the lateral hamstring being a little bit stronger, that will often lead to a lateral rotation of the tibia on the femur, which is pretty common in at least Westerners anyway.
And that's when you see someone stand, you can see their feet. Naturally, their kneecap is pointing straight ahead, but their feet are slightly turned out to the side.
And you'll also see when I watch somebody run, you'll often see that kind of flick out to the side. Instead of the feet coming straight ahead and the knee driving straight ahead, you'll see like that foot is just like a little cocked out to the side every time they take that step up. It's like it goes to the side and then it comes parallel, goes to the side and then it comes parallel. Other things are going on there too, but some of that too is just, I think that biceps is a little bit stronger. And they may even be running a little turned out, a little less parallel.
So in your world, I've got some ideas with this myself, but in your world, trying to balance that out, just the hamstrings, the medial and lateral hamstrings is a very big challenge to get them firing because oftentimes we're just doing some sort of leg curl. And so getting it to fire primarily the medial aspect, the semimembranosus tendinosus, rather than the biceps femoris. How do you do that? How do you sort of attack that?
So depending on the situation. So if there's a lot of knee pain, I'm pretty cautious with this because it does, like what I really am trying to do, or what I'm actually doing is rotating the tibia on the femur, which with a lot of knee pain is not necessarily a good idea. But if they can tolerate it, what I'll do is two things. One, I will work with a rotator disc in a seated position. So somebody's seated, knees at roughly a right angle. They've got a rotator disc underneath their foot, typically with no resistance, sometimes with light resistance. And basically, let's say I want to activate the medial hamstring, I'll essentially internally rotate on that. Now, if you don't have rotator disc, if you guys are sitting here listening to this, I can just do this from seated. If I'm seated and I put my hands behind my knee, so right behind my knee, but on the thigh side of my knee, and I just internally rotate my foot from there. So I'm internally rotating the tibia, basically. That will activate my medial hamstring. And you can kind of feel it if you do that. If I take it and I take the foot out, so just sweep the foot into lateral rotation, then I can get more of the biceps femoris. So that's just a simple way to feel the two muscles firing. And then if I'm doing something like a knee curl or a hamstring curl, then if I can, I will just, again, use the foot as my arrow, if you will, and just slightly internally rotate the foot or even have the foot parallel. Many people especially a really open chain hamstring curl, that lower leg is going to externally rotate, right? It's going to laterally rotate. That foot will be pointing out. So sometimes just trying to bring that foot to parallel or closer to parallel will help to fire that medial hamstring if that's the one that's not firing.
See, in my world, one of my favorite things to do is, and this goes by a lot of names, we call them hamstring walks. We have a little mechanic stool that mechanics use around,
it rolls around, right?
That rolls around and it's short to the ground. I don't want to be too high, which is why I don't like using an office chair, which some people do. I like being a little lower so they get a little bit more knee bend in there. But then I have them go up and down the hall, but I really have them focus on parallel, keeping their feet as parallel as possible. Because could I get them to internally rotate? Possibly, but I find they do that through the foot and the ankle. Whereas just focusing on keeping them parallel, you're really waking up. And I find sometimes that's all that needs to happen is you just need to wake up the semimembranosus tendinosus And that really can make a huge difference in trying to balance that out.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's a nice way to do that. Again, it's a closed chain hamstring curl.
Yep.
In parallel, right? The way that you're doing it. Yeah, and I'll do that. I mean, on the reformer, I'll do that, or even in something like knee stretch on the reformer, a single leg knee stretch, where I'll just, again, look at the angle and trying to get the work through the big toe and trying to make sure that foot is really parallel so it gets into that medial hamstring.
Something else to think about is a standing hamstring curl where you can't use much weight. I find leg weight of like 3 pounds, 5 pounds is more than a lot of people can stand, but having them slightly internally rotate. And when I say slightly, I just tell them, turn your toe in slight, just a little bit, just a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't have them do it a lot, but that can also do it, especially if you add in that internal rotation of the femur.
Yeah, just slight. And it doesn't have to be much. It's really just almost just, if you think about being parallel, you just let it slide a hair in.
Yep.
Right. It's really, for me, it's that subtle will really make that difference in terms of what's firing.
Yeah. Now, let's not forget the glute complex with that as well. When we talk about balancing out the knee, we've talked about medial to lateral. Okay, we want to make sure the vastus medialis is firing as strong as possible. And again, you're not going to, we don't live in the vacuum, so you're not going to be able to turn off the lateralis, but we want to try and get the medialis to fire as much as possible. We talked about the hamstring side to side, but we also want to talk about the glutes because they really support the knee in so many different ways in getting that co-contraction between the anterior and posterior muscles.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I don't think we talked too much about with the hip, but that firing, the sequence of firing between the hamstrings and the glute max particularly, that's just so interesting to me, how some people really don't fire their glute max at all in extension. They just don't. It's like mush. Other people, overfire it. Some people don't really fire their hamstrings that much. Like there's a whole balance there that I find, if I can really get that coordination happening between the hamstrings and the glute and that firing pattern going in the right sequence, I get a lot more effective propulsion, more power, more strength, more balance through the hip. And I also get a better ability to stabilize the hip and the femur.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And firing sequence is always a challenge, I find, just because for so many people, the hamstring begins to take over. And we see this in low back pain clients all the time when their glute's not firing nearly strong enough, is the hamstring is overworking. And that's firing way before the glutes are.
Yeah.
So you're right. Trying to get that sequence is very important.
One silly thing that I do, I call it butt popcorn. We talked about butt popcorn.
Yes.
Yeah. So many clients they're just sleepy, like their glutes are just asleep. And so just having them sitting, and you guys again can try it with us at home, and you just squeeze both your butt cheeks, so you're like going to get a little bit taller, or else you try squeezing one at a time. And you're that's why it's called popcorn, because it looks like you're kind of rocking side to side. I've had many clients who cannot fire at all from a seated position. Like those muscles they look at you like, what are you talking about? I don't know what you mean. And so for me, that's often a really simple way to just assess, like, are they firing at all? Can they access them at all or not? And then working on, getting that into how do they take hip extension? Does hip extension start from the glutes? Not usually. Does it start from the hamstrings? Do the glutes ever get involved, or is it really just stay in the hamstring? And you can see that when you watch somebody do, especially a prone hip extension with a bent knee. You can see it with a straight leg lift to the back. You can see it from standing. If they're doing a straight leg hip extension standing, you'll see if that glute fires and when it fires. And what I found, and I've talked, people have had both opinions on this. So my particular opinion at the moment is, if I want to get maximum range in hip extension, I kind of start with the hamstrings and then add the glutes in towards the end. Mm-hmm. A lot of people talked about just fire the glutes first. And it's like, if you can fire the glutes first, but that actually limits some of the ability of the extension in the hip to happen.
Interesting. Okay. I can see that.
And you can play with that. Like, again, you guys following us at home, if you stand up and you squeeze your butt, and then you try with a straight leg and try to extend your hip, you'll see how limited it is. It's definitely less range typically there. Whereas if I kind of start that hip extension more from the hamstrings and add the glute in at the end, that adds that last bit of strength at that end range. And that really will allow me to have the maximum range and extension while still getting the strength of the glute involved.
And that might be, yeah, no. And that makes a lot of sense. It might also be why when we see people in a prone position do hip extension, why people can go a lot higher when their knee starts to bend. Not a lot, but just that 10, 15 degrees, they're getting their hamstrings really firing a lot stronger. And that's something that I often will tell them to avoid because I want to make sure the glute is firing and that it's not all coming from the hamstring. But it's interesting. You're right. They do get larger range of motion. So I think balancing that out to make sure they're firing both is something to think about.
Yeah, it's also one other thing I sometimes see there is people just don't always have the range of motion in hip extension, right? If you've got somebody like a lot of my older clients, for example, just really don't have hip extension much. And I find that lack of range in hip extension also seems to limit the ability of the glutes to fire. But you kind of have to get to a certain range before those glutes will actually activate. And if they don't have that range in terms of just the joint, then the glute also seems to be pretty sleepy.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've got to work on mobility to get the strength going.
Interesting. So in trying to train it three-dimensionally, we want to tie in with the hip a little bit because the hip is a little easier to think of it from 3 dimensions because it really does move in 3 dimensions, whereas the knee really doesn't do that. There's a little bit in the screw home mechanism of rotation, yes, anywhere from 5 to 15, maybe even 20 degrees, depending on the person. But that's only in that terminal knee extension. That's only in that last little bit of knee extension. So really, when we're talking about working it three-dimensionally, we're really talking about medial to lateral, anterior to posterior in how we want to train it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other pieces of that are, right, if you look at the knee, and one of the things I love, I've done a lot of dissection of the knee, is looking at how all of the fascial planes from all of the muscles, from the front, the side, the back, come around and create this incredibly wonderful, complex support structure for the kneecap, for the knee, and for the patella. And so, when I look at that, like you definitely don't just see front and back. You see all these diagonals coming in from the adductors, from the vastus medialis, from the medial muscles, and from the lateral muscles. And so the other thing we also need to look at is adductor and abductor balance.
Yes.
Because that, again, if the knee is not sagittal, if it's tracking anywhere out or in or in any other position, which it does a lot of the time, as we've talked about, you've got to have that support from the hip, right, to make sure that knee is supported in that external rotation or in that medial rotation.
Right.
And thinking about the 3 that cross the knee, right, that come into our pes anserinus. We've got our sartorius. We've got our gracilis, we've got our semitendinosus. So we've got a hamstring, we've got an adductor, we've got basically a hip flexor.
And the pes anserinus is that common tendon point, common attachment point below the knee medially.
Right, on the tibia. So all 3 of those, and I always find that interesting because basically you have 3 muscles. One's a hip flexor, one's a hip extensor, one's an adductor. So they're doing 3 different things. They're doing the 3 different actions of that medial side of the knee. And they all come together at the same point. Mm-hmm. So it's just always one of those things like, so I've got to make sure that I balance out, ideally, right, those 3 poles because they're trying to get support for the medial knee from all directions. Right, so if I'm externally rotating, my stress may be active. If I'm flexed, if I'm extended, if I'm adducted. So whatever's happening, those 3 poles from the hip down in are going to support that medial knee.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we were talking just a little bit ago, one of the exercises that I always give my runners is going to be abduction. So really, we want to bring the hip into any type of, training of the knee. You need to. We can't train it in a vacuum. We need to bring the hip into that because, and I consider the gluteus medius to be one of the primary hips or primary knee stabilizers.
Absolutely.
because it really has so much effect on what the knee is going to do, whether it's internal rotation of the femur or just one-legged standing or any position. It's pulling on that, and it's helping assist the stability of the knee joint itself.
Well, think about functional movement. I mean, walking, running, right? If that glute med isn't doing its job to maintain the relationship of the femur and the pelvis, then where is that force going to go? That force is going to run right down into the knee, right? If you can maintain that stability up at the top, at the proximal point on the hip, then that knee doesn't have to worry about it, right?
Yep.
It's managed higher up. Then that knee isn't having to accommodate for an instability going laterally or medially.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always thought that the hip is one of those unsung heroes when it comes to working with someone with knee pain.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look at how few muscles really connect directly just to the knee.
Exactly.
I mean, you kind of have the popliteus, right?
Yep.
Right? I mean, really, you kind of have the popliteus. Everything else comes from the hip down or from the calf up, just like about the gastroc.
Exactly.
But really, that's it.
And what's interesting is we do talk about the hip, but when people think about the hip, a lot of times they're thinking about primarily just the gluteus medius. And I think the thing that gets not as much attention is the adductor group.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always, in Pilates, there's a bias towards the adductors, I would say. There's a lot of emphasis on strengthening adductors. Just as a general rule, a lot of things with the legs together and bringing the legs to midline and working in a kind of a tight parallel. And I think that emphasizes the fact that those typically are very weak. But I always like to test abduction and adduction because some people are adductor biased. Mm-hmm. Not always. It's rarer. Much more commonly, they're abductor biased. Sometimes they're weak in both places. But a lot of times, too, again, we talk about the front and back balance. We talk about the balance of the vastus medialis and lateralis, the two heads of the hamstrings. We also look at the abductor and adductor balance, right? Yep. Because that's something, too, where if you're going to do unexpected things with that knee, you want all four aspects of the leg to be able to support that.
Here's a thought. Just think about this for a minute, okay? Male versus female. And the reason I say that is because when I train my males, what I often find is that they're weak in their abductors in general, but their adductors, they never train. They never train their inner thighs. It's something that is, you try to do a side lunge, you try and do anything that's going to really stretch that area out and get it to contract, and they can't do it. They can't do anything straight-legged because it's so tight and so inhibited, whereas they're used to using their glutes. They're used to training that to a certain degree. And in any sport or activity, you're doing a lot of lateral movement and a lot of, side to side. So I wonder if, whereas with dancers, a lot of that bringing to the midline, like you said, and a lot more with women, I'm wondering if that's just more of a focus that they're more, like you said, adductor biased, whereas more men and people who have done more, sports, which would even include females who do things like soccer and all of that, a lot of lateral movement, may be more abductor biased.
Again, I'm thinking through my client list. You kind of go through the Rolodex in your head.
Yeah.
And I think there's certainly some truth in that. But again, I find that abductors and adductors can be randomly weak on different people. Like people that I would think would be adductor biased are not, and vice versa. People that I think should be strong in their abductors versus adductors, not always. So it's more something that I really just assess and kind of go, okay, well, how are your abductors? How are your adductors? And I'm thinking of one client I was just working with where, I had my hands around the outside. So I was just doing a simple manual abductor resistance, isometric and holding, like really strong. And then I went to just put my hands inside her adductor, so I ever squeeze my hands. Mm-hmm. There was nothing there, and she couldn't hold it. It was like she kind of would hold, and then it would just go soft. We're in the middle of an exercise doing this, and there was nothing there. And so I just always check that because it's something that you can't always just see from alignment or from other things. It doesn't always show up in other areas. So I just always like to test those two, and then to work on whichever one is weaker.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right. Well, we do have to wrap things up because I know you have to go today. But let's talk about what's that one exercise that you would consider would be good for the hip or the knee, that's going to that a little bit of a takeaway, whether it be terminal knee extension, whether it's something that's going to balance things out. Give me one.
So well, I think we did this last time too, but I'm gonna get a little crazy here.
Okay.
For three-dimensional work around the knee, certainly all we talked about in terms of the vastus medialis and strengthening that and releasing the lateral leg. I mean, that's just step one. But what I really like to do is I just like to work with whatever footwork I'm doing, whether it's work on the reformer with the foot bar, whether it's standing lunge work or standing squat work. I just play with different angles. It's like, just don't be satisfied with just going parallel. Take that leg turned out, take it slightly turned in. I just play with that. So that's more where I'd go, is just whatever you're doing, don't be satisfied with just one position. Mm-hmm. Just make sure that if you're doing let's say a big wide turned out squat, that's great. Do some of those, then come to like maybe halfway to parallel, and then maybe do a parallel squat, even if it's much smaller. It doesn't have to be low, but just playing with those different angles so that knee gets some preparation and stimulation in different directions.
I love it.
That's really what I'd say.
I love that.
And
I love that. I'm going to go, I was going to say something very similar, which would be in a squatted position. Every time you do a squat, slightly change your foot position.
Yeah.
Whether it be sumo squat where the feet are very wide, whether it be narrow, whether it be, halfway in between. But not only that, but maybe one is facing 1 o'clock and the other foot is facing 10 o'clock. So one's turned out a little bit more.
Nice.
Because I guarantee when I stand up out of this chair, my knees are not my feet are not going to be exactly at the same angle. They're going to be slightly turned slightly turned out in some varying degree. So by training that and maybe doing one set parallel, one set slightly turned out, then one more turned out, one less, and just getting it to move, and maybe even doing a little internal rotation, and I'm only talking a little bit, and really restricting my range of motion, obviously, really getting it from all sides and changing that vector of where it's pulling from.
Nice. Love that. I think that's awesome. Yeah. And again, asymmetry, right? Because real life is not symmetrical that way.
Not at all.
Even if you just are walking straight and want to turn to the right, for example, right? My left foot's going to keep going straight ahead. My right foot's going to turn out to the right, even if it's just a little bit to go around a corner.
Yep.
And so we're always working in those asymmetrical ways where one leg is facing this way, one leg is facing that way. So I love that. That's really nice addition to put into that and really start to train those differences, those asymmetries.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
And I think asymmetrical training is so important just for reality, real life, functional training.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go. Thank you guys very much for joining us here at Moving Conversations. You can always reach us on our social media. We're at Moving Convos on Instagram. We're also at Moving Convos at gmail.com, so you can reach us there as well. So if you have any questions or comments. And until next time, I'm Brian Ritchie.
And I'm Nora St. John.
And we'll be seeing you next time.
Bye, guys.